God, who is rich in mercy, out of the great love with which he loved us, even when we were dead through our trespasses, made us alive together with Christ. The first line of Ephesians chapter 2, verse 4, the first line of our second reading today, God, who is rich in mercy, is a title of an entire encyclical written by John Paul II. An entire encyclical about God's mercy, about confession, about our need for confession and our need to live in that mercy of God. It's also the Episcopal model of our bishop, Bishop Vinke. Rich in mercy is his Episcopal motto, living out of this mercy that God desires to give us. To understand this line, it's good for us to read the first few lines before it that our reading did not include today, but it's important for us to hear it. Ephesians chapter 2, verse 1. And you he made alive when you were dead through the trespasses and sins in which you once walked, following the course of this world, following the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that is now at work in the sons of disobedience. Among these, we all at once lived in the passions of our flesh, following the desires of body and mind. And so we were by nature children of wrath, like the rest of mankind. And you he made alive when you were dead. St. Paul is making reference here to this death that we are born into. I think it's important for us to recognize the seriousness of sin. Sin isn't just something that we do and it's like, oops, I did that. Sin literally causes death. Mortal sin means death. Death to our soul, meaning that we have no life within us. When we are in the state of mortal sin, we are outside of the grace of God. We are outside of sanctifying grace. We are outside of the salvation that God gives. When we are outside of God's salvation, we are damned. We are headed for hell. And in some way are beginning to live that hell here on earth when we live outside of the grace of God. Because ultimately hell is the absence of God, or our turning our backs on God. But St. Paul specifically is speaking about original sin. And when we think about original sin, many times we think about, it's this thing that Adam and Eve did. And then because of what they did and because of their choice, we all suffer from that. Original sin is not quite like that. Yes, original sin entered in because of something that Adam and Eve did. It was a work that they did that pulled them outside of the sanctifying grace and outside of the grace of God. But what we inherit is not that sin. What we inherit is an absence. It's a lacking. Original sin is the lacking of sanctifying grace. Adam and Eve, when they sinned, caused the sanctifying grace to leave them, the grace that saves them to leave them. And because of their choice, that is passed on. Because of them being the first parents of all of creation, that sin is inherited by all of us. But it's not something that we did, it's something that we lack. We lack sanctifying grace when we are born. This is why St. Paul refers, and the church refers to everyone who is born as sons of Adam. We're sons of Adam because we are lacking sanctifying grace. We are in original sin when we are born. So baptism is necessary as soon as possible so we can be no longer sons of Adam, but we can be sons of God. Through baptism, we become sons and daughters of God, reborn into the life of Christ, reborn into that sanctifying grace. We see how this plays out when St. Paul says in Romans chapter 6, he says, "Do you not know that you are baptized into the death of Christ, so you may rise with him in life?" Baptism is a spiritual death, a spiritual cleansing, and a renewal, and a rising, a resurrection from that death of that original sin that we are in, because we inherit it from Adam and Eve, to a resurrection into Christ, into sanctifying grace. And we live in that grace, and we are called to live out of that divine nature in which we are living in that moment every day of our life. When a child is baptized, and the church teaches us, until they reach the age of 7, they can't commit actual sin. The sin that is committed by someone when they have the use of their reason to choose to do something that they know isn't good for them. They choose to go against God's will. But a newborn baby that has been baptized, in a sense, when we hold that baby and we look upon that baby who is in sanctifying grace and cannot sin, it is like we are looking at God. It is like we are holding God in our hands, in our arms, because of their relationship to that divine nature which they have received in baptism. And they remain in that state until they commit sin. What an amazing gift. You're probably all thinking, Father, have you seen my 2-year-old? Yeah, I know. I have about 75 of them over here. Not 2-year-olds, but I know. God is rich in mercy. So rich in his mercy that he desires for us to live with him, to walk with him. St. Paul goes on to say, St. Paul explains all of this coming into God's mercy, all of what happens in baptism in those first few verses, and then goes into that line, but God, who is rich in mercy, out of love. And we hear this in the gospel again today. God, who loves so much, gave his only begotten Son. And what does he go on to say after that? What does St. John say after that? He said, some choose to remain in darkness. How many of us choose to remain in darkness? How many of us choose to not root out the darkness that's in our heart? Some unforgiveness, hatred, pride, lust, gluttony, wrath, the deadly sins that we are taught about. How many of us choose to remain in those sins, choose to remain in the darkness instead of living in the richness of God's mercy? Sometimes we choose to live there because we're afraid of confession. Sometimes we choose to live there because we like it. And it's a challenge to actually go beyond that and to begin to live in the light of Christ. Sometimes we're just obstinate and just refuse. Sometimes we don't realize how terrible sin is and what it does to us. I think if we were to be honest and we look out into the world, we can see what sin does. We can see how it destroys relationships. We can see how it turns us against God. We can see what it begins to do to the entire society. And so the turning away from that sin begins with us. It begins by us living in the grace of God. St. Paul goes on in verse 6. So we'll start at verse 5. Even when we were dead through our trespasses, made us alive together with Christ, and raised us up with him, and made us sit with him in the heavenly places in Christ Jesus. At that moment of baptism, we are raised up to sit with Christ in heaven. Commentators speak about this as like an ascension, like we are taken up into heaven for those moments that we live in that sanctifying grace after our baptism. that in the coming ages we might show the immeasurable riches of his grace and kindness toward us in Christ Jesus. This passage is also a passage that Catholics and Protestants often argue about. Because in verse 8, St. Paul says, "For by grace you have been saved through faith. And this is not your own doing, it is the gift of God." Many Protestants will argue that we're saved by faith alone. We're saved by faith alone. We recognize as Catholics that the initial moment in which God restores us to sanctifying grace, there is nothing that we can do to earn that. It is purely the grace of God that enters in and transforms us. There is not a thing that we can do in the world in order for ourselves to be turned to live in sanctifying grace. We do nothing to earn that. It's purely the grace of God. And we see that when a child is baptized. A child does nothing to earn that sanctifying grace of their baptism. It is a free gift that God gives to them when their parents bring them forward to be baptized, so that they may live in that sanctifying grace, so that they may live with God in those years until they commit that first sin, until they have the ability of the use of their reason in order to do that. We as Catholics realize that salvation is a process. We see that we will be judged by our works. St. Paul goes on to say in verse 9, "Not because of works, lest any man should boast. For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works." So we are saved by God, not by the works that we perform, but purely by the gift of God. But God saves us for works so that we can do good works, to live out of that sanctifying grace, so that we may receive salvation at the end that is purely the grace of God. Because we don't earn our salvation, but we are also judged by our works. St. Paul tells us in Romans chapter 2 that you will be judged by your works. In the epistle of St. James, it says, "I will show you my faith by my works." Can you show me your faith without works? The works that we perform are the good deeds, the works of mercy that God calls us to go out into the world and to bring others to know the riches of God's mercy. I love this line, "For we are his workmanship." Every single one of us is saved by God's grace. We are God's work. And because we are God's work, everything that we do ought to exemplify the very fact that God has saved us. The very fact that God is working in our life and has redeemed us and given us sanctifying grace so that we can live out of that sanctifying grace. And because we are God's workmanship, when we go out into the world, we ought to be explaining to everyone, not just exclaiming, but proclaiming God's mercy in our lives. Proclaiming to every single person that we meet that we have received God's mercy. And our God, who is so rich in mercy, pours that mercy out into us because of his great love for us. And it's nothing that we earn. It's the realization that when we turn to God and we enter into his life, he bestows that grace upon us. St. Paul knows, and we all know, that even after our baptism, we do choose disobedience. We have what's called concupiscence. It is the temporal punishment that's left over from original sin. When we talk about temporal punishment, all sin has some form of temporal punishment. It's what's left over from sin. It's the way that sin begins to form our soul. So, for instance, if I tell a lie, I am more inclined to lie again. That is the temporal punishment that is left over from the sin that I have committed. if I fall into lust, I will continue to fall into that lust unless I do the penance and I begin to attack that sin at its root and begin to cut that sin off at its root. But if I just realize, well, I fell into lust, but I don't actually go to the root of that lust, that sin keeps popping back up like a weed that we're trying to get rid of. We have to actually dig it out, root it out. All sin has a root. When we go to confession, it's good for us to dig deep into our soul and to find the root of that sin. Sometimes it takes some time to figure out what it is. Yes, there are the actions and kind of the fruits of the sin out here, but at the root, there's something deeper that we have this proclivity towards that sin. And so this is why we have Lent. This is why we have the practices during Lent of prayer, fasting, and almsgiving, to dig into the roots of those sins that are often related to prayer, fasting, and almsgiving. Those works, those spiritual works, help us to root out and find the roots of those sins so we can actually do the hard work and begin to heal those areas of our life that have been damaged and wounded by that sin. But it's God's mercy that allows us to do that. A regular examination of conscience helps us to see the fruits of sin. And when we begin to see the roots of sin and we enter into prayer and meditation with our God, we begin to actually dig into the roots as well. When we ask God to reveal to us and show to us in all humility and vulnerability with God, we can actually begin to see those roots and begin to attack them. And when we begin to attack them, we can live in the grace in a greater way than we ever have before. That's where true joy begins to enter in. When we actually live out of that grace and live out of God's grace, recognizing that we are a sinner in constant need of God's grace. And that we, in that vulnerability that we experience in that moment, there is a tremendous joy, knowing that there's nothing we can do without God's grace. When we live in sanctifying grace, we actually become holier. The more holy we become, it means that we're living in God's grace even more. When we avail ourselves to God's grace and we go out into the world and we share that grace and share God's message with others, that He is rich in mercy, the space for that grace expands, if we can call it a space. And the more that we open ourselves to God's grace, the holier we become. The more that it roots out sin. The more that it roots out the roots of sin. So we can live confidently in God's grace. Our lives as Christians, our lives as Catholics, are meant to be a constant witness to this very passage today. I pray that every single one of us takes this to heart. I pray that every single one of us lives in the richness of God's mercy and constantly makes ourselves aware of God's mercy and receives His mercy. And we live in that sanctifying grace that comes from not just baptism, but all of the sacraments. So we may be a joyful witness in the world and bring others to know God's mercy as well.